After my husband died, the will named me sole heir. My daughter-in-law shrieked it all belonged to her. That night, she dumped my things on the street. At dawn, she burst in to seize the fortune, but her legs shook when she saw who held my hand. I should have known something was wrong the moment Victoria walked into the lawyer's office that gray Tuesday morning. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with purpose, each step echoing through the quiet hallway like a countdown. She wore her best black dress, the one with the pearl buttons that Robert had always said made her look sophisticated. But there was something in her eyes that day, something sharp and calculating that made my stomach clench. Robert had been gone for exactly 2 weeks. 2 weeks since I'd held his hand as he took his last breath in our bedroom, surrounded by 43 years of memories. 2 weeks since I'd watched them lower his casket into the ground, while our son David wept beside me. 2 weeks of sleepless nights in our empty house, drinking cold coffee and wondering how I was supposed to go on without him. The reading of the will was supposed to be a formality. Robert and I had discussed it countless times over the years.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Always agreeing that everything would go to me first, then to David when my time came. Simple, clean, the way Robert liked to handle things. Mr. Gadier Henderson, our family lawyer for over 20 years, cleared his throat and began reading in that formal tone lawyers use when they're trying to make terrible news sound official. But the news wasn't terrible, at least, not for me. To my beloved wife Margaret, I leave everything. The house on Elm Street, all bank accounts, investments, and personal possessions. She has been my partner in life and deserves security in her remaining years. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Robert had kept his promise. I wouldn't have to worry about money or losing our home. I could grieve in peace, surrounded by our things, our memories. That's when Victoria's voice cut through the quiet office like a knife. That can't be right. Mr. Henderson looked up over his reading glasses, his eyebrows raised. I beg your pardon? Victoria leaned forward in her chair, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white. That will, it can't be right. Robert promised David the house. He said it would be David's inheritance. I stared at her, confused. When had Robert ever said such a thing? David was only 35. He and Victoria had their own home, their own life. Why would they need our house? Mrs. Phillips, Mr. Henderson said carefully, I can assure you this will is legitimate. Mr. Phillips signed it in my presence just 6 months ago, with 2 witnesses present. Victoria's face had turned an alarming shade of red. But what about David? What about his children? Robert wouldn't leave everything to her. She's old. She doesn't need all this money. The word old hit me like a slap. I was 68, yes. But I wasn't decrepit. I wasn't ready for a nursing home. I was still Margaret Phillips, the woman who had worked side by side with Robert to build everything we had. David, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. Victoria, please. Dad knew what he was doing, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Victoria had planted a seed, and it was already beginning to grow. Did he, though? Victoria turned to face David, her voice dropping to that sweet, concerned tone she used when she wanted something. David, your father was sick for months before he died. The medications, the pain. Do we really know he was thinking clearly when he signed this? My heart stopped. She was suggesting Robert hadn't been competent when he made his will. She was questioning his mental state, his love for me, everything we had built together. Victoria, that's enough, I said, my voice shaking. Robert was perfectly clear about what he wanted. We discussed it many times. She turned to me then, and the mask slipped completely. The sweet daughter-in-law I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Did you discuss it, Margaret? Or did you manipulate a dying man into leaving you everything while his son gets nothing? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. David's face went pale. Mr. Henderson shuffled his papers uncomfortably. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Phillips, the lawyer said quietly, and completely unfounded. Mr. Phillips was examined by his physician just days before signing this will. He was declared mentally competent, but Victoria wasn't finished. She stood up, towering over me in her high heels, her voice rising with each word. This isn't over. David deserves what's rightfully his. Robert built that house for his family, not just for you. You can't keep everything while his son struggles to make ends meet. Struggles to make ends meet? David was a successful accountant. They lived in a beautiful home in the suburbs, drove expensive cars, took vacations to Europe. What struggles was she talking about? As we left the lawyer's office, Victoria walked ahead of us, her phone pressed to her ear. I caught fragments of her conversation, completely unreasonable. Everything. We'll have to do something about this. David walked beside me in silence, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. When we reached our cars, he finally looked at me. Mom, maybe Victoria has a point. Dad did always talk about leaving me the house someday. Someday, David. When I'm gone. Not now. When I need it most. He nodded, but I could see Victoria's words had taken root. My own son was beginning to doubt his father's wishes, beginning to doubt me. That evening, I sat in Robert's chair, surrounded by 43 years of our life together. The photos on the mantel showed our journey, our wedding day, David's birth, family vacations, graduations, grandchildren. This wasn't just a house or a bank account. This was our life, our history. But Victoria saw only dollar signs, and somehow, she was convincing my son to see them too. I fell asleep in Robert's chair that night, clutching his favorite coffee mug, trying to hold on to what was left of the life we'd built together. I had no idea that by morning, Victoria would begin her campaign to take it all away from me. The phone calls started the next day. Victoria, always with that concerned voice, asking how I was coping, if I needed help with anything. But underneath the sweetness was something else. Questions about my finances, suggestions that the house was too big for one person, comments about how hard it must be to manage everything alone. Then came the visits. Victoria would stop by unannounced, always with some excuse. She needed to get something from David's old room, or she wanted to help me organize Robert's things. But I noticed how her eyes moved around our home, cataloging, evaluating. This place is worth a fortune now, she said one afternoon, running her hand along the antique dining table Robert and I had bought for our 10th anniversary. The real estate market is booming. You could get so much money for this house, Margaret. Enough to buy a lovely little condo somewhere with no maintenance, no yard work. I don't want a condo, Victoria. I want my home. She smiled that tight smile she'd perfected. Of course you do, dear. But sometimes we have to make practical decisions. David and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to consider your options. My options, as if I didn't have the right to choose for myself. The conversations with David became strained. Every phone call included some mention of the house, the inheritance, how difficult things were for Victoria and him. He never said it directly, but the implication was clear. I was being selfish by keeping what Robert had left me. 3 weeks after the will reading, I found my suitcases on the front porch. I stared at those 4 pieces of luggage lined up on my own front porch like abandoned children. My hands shook as I picked up the note tucked under the handle of my largest suitcase. The handwriting was Victoria's, all sharp angles and impatience. Margaret, we've decided you need professional care. The house is too much for you to handle alone. We've found a lovely assisted living facility. Your things are packed. Victoria and David, professional care, assisted living facility. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. They had gone through my personal belongings, decided what I could keep, and packed me up like I was already dead. I fumbled for my phone with trembling fingers and called David. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. Then I called the house phone, the number I had been calling for 30 years when it was my house, my phone. Victoria answered on the 3rd ring. Hello? Victoria, what is this? What have you done? There was a pause, then that sickeningly sweet voice. Oh, Margaret, we were hoping to talk to you in person, but you weren't answering your phone. I was at the grocery store. I was buying food for the house, for my house. Well, that's just it, dear. David and I have been so worried about you. Living alone in that big house, trying to manage everything by yourself. It's just not safe anymore. Not safe. I was 68 years old, not 98. I drove, I cooked, I paid my bills, I maintained my home. What wasn't safe about any of that? Where's David? I want to talk to my son. David agrees with me completely, Margaret. We both think this is the best solution. The Sunset Manor is lovely. They have activities, meal service, medical care right on site. You'll love it there. Sunset Manor. The name alone made me feel like I was being measured for a coffin. Victoria, you can't just throw me out of my own home. Robert left this house to me. Actually, her voice turned cold. We've been looking into that. David remembers several conversations with his father about inheriting the house. We think there might have been some confusion about Robert's intentions. Confusion. As if 43 years of marriage and countless conversations with my husband about our wishes were just confusion. The will was clear, Victoria. Mr. Henderson explained everything. Wills can be contested, Margaret, especially when there are questions about the deceased's mental state at the time of signing. There it was again. The suggestion that Robert hadn't been thinking clearly, that I had somehow manipulated him. My husband, who had been sharp as a tack right up until the end, who had held my hand and told me he loved me hours before he died. I'm not going anywhere, Victoria. This is my home. I heard her sigh. That patient sound people make when they're dealing with a difficult child. I'm afraid you don't have much choice, dear. We've already moved your essential belongings out. The locks have been changed for security reasons. I'm sure you understand. The locks had been changed. They had changed the locks on my own house. I walked to the front door and tried my key. It didn't fit. 43 years of walking through that door, and now I was locked out like a stranger. You can't do this, I whispered into the phone. We already have. The moving truck will be here tomorrow to get the rest of your things. Someone from Sunset Manor will call you about the admission process. The line went dead. I sank down onto my porch steps, surrounded by my suitcases, and finally let myself cry. Not the quiet tears I'd shed at Robert's funeral, but great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside me. I cried for my husband, for my son who had turned against me, for the home I was losing, for the life that was being stolen from me piece by piece. Mrs. Chen from next door must have heard me. She came rushing over, still wearing her gardening gloves. Margaret, what's wrong? What are these suitcases doing out here? I couldn't even form the words. I just handed her the note. She read it twice, her expression growing darker each time. They can't do this. This is your house. They changed the locks, I managed to say. Mrs. Chen's face flushed with anger. We're calling the police. But when Officer Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, he explained what Victoria had probably already known. Since the house was legally mine, I could file a complaint, but it would take time to resolve. Meanwhile, I needed somewhere to stay. Do you have family you can call? He asked gently. I thought of my sister Ruth, living in her small apartment across town. We hadn't been close since Mother died. Too many years of different lives, different choices, but she was all I had left. Ruth answered on the second ring. When I explained what had happened, there was a long silence. Pack up your things, she said finally. I'm coming to get you. An hour later, I was loading my suitcases into Ruth's old Honda, taking one last look at the house Robert and I had called home for so many years. The windows glowed warmly in the evening light. I could see Victoria moving around inside, probably already rearranging my furniture, claiming my space. Ruth's apartment was tiny but clean, with barely enough room for one person, let alone two. She cleared out her craft room and set up an air mattress for me. I can't believe David would do this to you, she said as we sat at her small kitchen table, sharing a dinner of canned soup and crackers. Robert would be rolling over in his grave. Victoria has him completely convinced that I'm some kind of burden, that I can't take care of myself. Nonsense. You're sharper than women half your age. This isn't about your capabilities, Margaret. This is about money. Ruth was right, of course. Victoria had seen dollar signs the moment she walked out of that lawyer's office. The house, the bank accounts, the investments Robert had built up over decades of hard work. She wanted it all. What are you going to do? Ruth asked. I don't know. Mr. Henderson says contesting the will could take months, maybe years, and it would be expensive. You can't just give up. But that night, lying on the air mattress in Ruth's craft room, surrounded by boxes of yarn and fabric scraps, I felt like giving up was exactly what I wanted to do. I was tired of fighting, tired of defending myself, tired of trying to convince my own son that I deserved basic respect. At 3 a.m, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David. Mom, I know this is hard, but Victoria's right. Dad would want you to be safe and cared for. We'll visit you at Sunset Manor as often as we can. I stared at that message for a long time. My son, the little boy I had rocked to sleep, nursed through illnesses, cheered at baseball games, helped with homework, sent to college, danced with at his wedding. That little boy was gone. In his place was a man who could throw his mother out of her own home and call it love. I didn't respond to his text. What was there to say? The next morning, Ruth had to go to work at the library where she'd been employed for 30 years. I sat alone in her small living room, drinking instant coffee and staring out the window at a view that wasn't mine, in a space that wasn't mine, wondering how my life had become so small so quickly. That's when I saw the news report on Ruth's old television, a story about elder abuse, about families who manipulated older relatives out of their homes and finances. The reporter interviewed a lawyer who specialized in elder rights, a stern-looking woman named Patricia Wells. Many seniors don't realize they have legal protections, she was saying. Just because someone is older doesn't mean they forfeit their right to make decisions about their own lives and property. I wrote down her name, Patricia Wells. For the first time since finding my suitcases on the porch, I felt a tiny flicker of something that might have been hope. Victoria thought she had won. She thought I was just a confused old woman who would quietly disappear into assisted living and let her claim everything Robert had worked for. She was about to learn how wrong she could be. Patricia Wells had an office in downtown Portland, in one of those old brick buildings that had been converted into professional suites. When I called her that morning, her secretary somehow managed to fit me in that same afternoon. Ruth insisted on driving me there, taking time off from the library. "You don't have to do this alone," she said as we rode the elevator to the third floor. "I should have been there for you more after Robert died." Patricia Wells was exactly what I had expected from seeing her on television. Sharp, professional, with kind but intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything. The will reading, Victoria's accusations, being locked out of my own home, the forced move to Ruth's apartment. When I finished, she leaned back in her leather chair and studied me carefully. "Mrs. Phillips, what you're describing sounds like elder abuse. Not physical abuse, but financial and emotional manipulation designed to separate you from your assets. But the will is legal. Mr. Henderson confirmed that. Yes, but there are other factors to consider. The fact that they changed your locks, packed your belongings without permission, and are pressuring you to move to assisted living against your will. These are red flags." She pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes. "Tell me about your daughter-in-law. How long have she and David been married?" 8 years. They met when David was going through his divorce from his first wife. Patricia's pen paused. "First wife? Tell me about that." I thought back to those difficult years. David was married to Sarah for 6 years. They had 2 children together, Emma and Michael. Sarah was a teacher, very down to earth. But the divorce was messy. David said Sarah had become controlling, demanding. And Victoria? Victoria swept in like a whirlwind during the divorce proceedings. She was so supportive, so understanding. She helped David through everything, took care of him when he was at his lowest point. Patricia made more notes. "What does Victoria do for work?" "She's a real estate agent, or was. She quit working about 2 years ago. Said David was making enough to support them both." Interesting. And what happened to David's relationship with his children from his first marriage? That question hit me like a punch to the stomach. He barely sees them anymore. Victoria said it was too confusing for Emma and Michael to go back and forth between households. She convinced David that it would be better for the children if he stepped back, let them have stability with their mother. As I said the words out loud, I realized how they sounded. Victoria had systematically separated David from his children, just like she was now separating him from me. "Mrs. Phillips, I'd like to do some research on your daughter-in-law. With your permission, of course. Sometimes patterns emerge that can be very telling." I agreed immediately. Something about Victoria had never felt right to me, but I had attributed it to the normal tension between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law. Now I wondered if my instincts had been trying to tell me something much more serious. 2 days later, Patricia called with information that made my blood run cold. "Can you come in this afternoon? I think you need to see what I've found." Ruth drove me back downtown, grumbling about having to take another afternoon off work. But when we sat down in Patricia's office and she opened a thick file folder, Ruth fell silent. "Victoria Martinez Phillips," Patricia began, age 34. "But before she married your son, she was Victoria Martinez Thompson, married to a man named Frank Thompson in Phoenix, Arizona." She slid a photograph across the desk. It was definitely Victoria, but younger, with darker hair and a different style of dress. Frank Thompson was 67 when he married Victoria. He was a widower, recently retired, with substantial assets including a home and a pension fund. My heart started pounding. Frank died 18 months after their marriage. Heart attack. Very sudden, according to the medical records. He had no children, no close family. Victoria inherited everything. Patricia pulled out another document. But here's where it gets interesting. Frank's neighbors reported to police that in the months before his death, Victoria had been talking about how hard it was to care for an older husband, how isolated Frank had become, how he wasn't capable of making good decisions anymore. The words were almost identical to what Victoria had been saying about me. The police investigated, briefly, but Frank's doctor confirmed he'd had heart problems, and Victoria appeared to be a grieving widow. She sold the house 6 months later and moved to Oregon. Ruth leaned forward in her chair, where she met David. Patricia nodded grimly, at a support group for people going through difficult divorces. Victoria presented herself as a widow struggling to rebuild her life after losing her husband. I felt sick. She never mentioned being married before. David thinks she's only been married once to him. There's more. Patricia pulled out additional papers. I found records of Victoria working for a home care agency in Phoenix before she married Frank Thompson. She specialized in caring for elderly men who lived alone. The pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear. Victoria targeted vulnerable older men, married them, inherited their assets, then moved on to the next victim. Except this time, she had married a younger man who came with an aging mother and a substantial inheritance on the horizon. Mrs. Phillips, I believe your daughter-in-law has been planning this for years. She knew that eventually you would inherit your husband's estate, and she positioned herself to be there when it happened. But David, he loves her. He thinks she loves him. Patricia's expression softened. Your son may very well love her, but I suspect Victoria sees him as a means to an end. A way to access your family's wealth without having to wait for another elderly husband to die. Ruth grabbed my hand. Margaret, you have to tell David. He won't believe me. He's completely under her spell. Patricia leaned forward. That's why we need concrete evidence. What I've found so far establishes a pattern, but we need more to build a strong case. What kind of evidence? I want to hire a private investigator to document Victoria's current activities. If she's systematically isolating you and pressuring you to give up your assets, we need to document that. I also want to look more closely at her marriage to Frank Thompson. The cost would be expensive, but I had Robert's life insurance money that Victoria probably thought she could get her hands on eventually. Do it, I said, whatever it costs. That evening, back at Ruth's apartment, I sat at her kitchen table trying to process everything I had learned. Victoria wasn't just a manipulative daughter-in-law. She was a predator who had made a career out of targeting vulnerable older people, and my son was her latest victim, just as much as I was. Ruth made us both cups of tea and sat down across from me. How are you holding up? I keep thinking about Frank Thompson. That poor man. He probably thought he'd found love in his later years, and instead he found someone who was just waiting for him to die. You don't know that she killed him, Margaret. Maybe not directly, but she killed his spirit, his connections to other people, his sense of self-worth, just like she's trying to do to me. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Victoria. Margaret, the people at Sunset Manor are expecting you tomorrow at 2 p.m. for your intake appointment. David will pick you up at 1:30. I stared at the message. Victoria was still assuming I would just go along with her plans, that I would meekly allow myself to be warehoused in an assisted living facility while she took over my life. I typed back, I won't be needing assisted living. I'm perfectly capable of caring for myself. Her response came back within minutes. Margaret, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're all trying to do what's best for you. What's best for me? As if stealing my home and my independence was somehow an act of love. I turned off my phone without responding. Tomorrow I would start fighting back. Patricia had given me hope that there might be a way to stop Victoria, to save David from her manipulation, and to reclaim the life she had stolen from me. But tonight, I just wanted to sit with Ruth and drink tea and remember what it felt like to have someone in my corner, someone who believed in me and saw me as more than just an obstacle to be overcome. Thank you, I said to Ruth, for everything. She squeezed my hand. That's what sisters are for, even if it took me too long to remember that. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I might not be completely alone in this fight. The private investigator Patricia recommended was a woman named Linda Carson, a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes against the elderly. She met Ruth and me at a small cafe downtown, deliberately choosing a corner table where we couldn't be overheard. Linda was younger than I expected, maybe in her 40s, with short graying hair and alert brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She had the kind of calm, professional demeanor that made me feel like I was finally being taken seriously. "Mrs. Phillips, I've reviewed the preliminary information Patricia gathered. Your daughter-in-law fits a very specific profile of someone who targets families for financial exploitation." She pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. "What I need from you is a detailed timeline of Victoria's behavior since your husband's death. Every conversation, every incident, every change in your living situation. The smallest details might be important." For the next hour, I walked Linda through everything I could remember: Victoria's reaction at the will reading, the subtle comments about my mental state, the gradual isolation from David, the changed locks, the forced packing of my belongings. "She's been very careful," Linda observed. "Nothing overtly illegal, but a clear pattern of psychological manipulation. What about your son? How has his behavior changed since your husband died?" That question was almost too painful to answer. "David used to call me every few days. We'd have dinner together once a week. He'd ask for my advice about work, about life. Since Victoria started her campaign, he barely speaks to me unless she's pushing him to do something. Has he said anything that suggests Victoria is influencing his thoughts about you?" I thought about David's text message, about his suggestion that I needed professional care. He keeps repeating Victoria's words almost exactly: that I need to be safe, that the house is too much for me, that Dad would want me to be taken care of. Linda made detailed notes. "I'm going to start surveillance on Victoria's daily activities. I want to document where she goes, who she meets with, what she does with her time. Sometimes these predators have multiple targets or ongoing schemes. The thought that Victoria might be manipulating other families while she was destroying mine made me feel sick." "There's something else," Linda continued. "Patricia mentioned that your daughter-in-law was previously married to an elderly man who died suddenly. I want to dig deeper into that relationship, see if there are any other similar relationships in her past." Over the next 2 weeks, Linda's reports painted a disturbing picture of Victoria's activities. She had been visiting real estate offices, getting appraisals on my house. She had met with an interior designer about updating an older home for sale. Most damning, she had been researching assisted living facilities, not just Sunset Manor, but several others, comparing costs and availability. "She's planning to warehouse you somewhere cheap and sell your house for maximum profit," Linda explained during one of our meetings. The interior designer confirmed that Victoria presented herself as the homeowner, said she had inherited the property from an elderly relative who had moved to a care facility. Ruth slammed her coffee cup down so hard it rattled the table. "The nerve of that woman! Margaret, you have to tell David what she's really doing." But Linda shook her head. "Not yet. We need more evidence, and we need to be strategic about how we present it. Right now, David sees Victoria as his loving wife, who's trying to help his difficult mother. If we come at him with accusations, he'll just circle the wagons and protect her. So what do? We let her make a mistake. People like Victoria get overconfident. They start cutting corners, getting sloppy. Eventually, she'll do something that exposes her true nature. That opportunity came sooner than expected. Linda called me on a Thursday morning, excitement clear in her voice. "Mrs. Phillips, I need you to meet me at Patricia's office immediately, and bring Ruth if she can come." An hour later, we sat in Patricia's conference room while Linda spread out photographs and documents across the large table. "Victoria made contact with someone yesterday. A man named Harold Brennan, age 74, widower, owns a house in southeast Portland worth about $400,000. She showed us surveillance photos of Victoria meeting with an elderly man at a coffee shop, leaning across the table toward him with that same concerned, attentive expression I had seen her use on David. Harold's wife died 6 months ago. He's been struggling with loneliness, depression. Victoria approached him at a grief support group. My blood ran cold. She's targeting another victim while she's still working on stealing from me? It gets worse." Linda pulled out more documents. "I did some digging into Frank Thompson's death in Arizona. The timeline is very interesting. Frank changed his will to make Victoria his sole beneficiary exactly 3 weeks before he died. Before that, he had planned to leave everything to a nephew in California." Patricia leaned forward. 3 weeks. That suggests Victoria knew something was going to happen to Frank. There's more. Frank's doctor prescribed him a new heart medication the week before he died. The prescription was filled by Victoria, but according to the pharmacy records, she also filled a prescription for herself that same day. A medication that can cause dangerous interactions with heart medication if taken together. The room went silent as the implications sank in. "Are you saying Victoria poisoned him?" Ruth asked quietly. "I'm saying there are enough questions about Frank's death to warrant a new investigation, especially now that we can establish a pattern with Harold Brennan and with what she's doing to your family." Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out legal documents. "Margaret, I think it's time to go on the offensive. I want to file for an emergency restraining order to prevent Victoria from accessing or selling any of your property. I also want to file a complaint with Adult Protective Services about the elder abuse you've suffered. But what about David? This will destroy my relationship with my son." "Your relationship with your son is already being destroyed," Patricia said gently. "Victoria is systematically turning him against you. The only way to save David is to expose Victoria for what she really is." Linda gathered up her photographs. "I'm going to contact the Phoenix Police Department about reopening Frank Thompson's case, and I'm going to warn Harold Brennan about what Victoria is really after." "You can do that?" "I can share publicly available information about Victoria's background. What Harold does with that information is up to him." As we left Patricia's office that afternoon, I felt like I was standing at a crossroads. For weeks, I had been reacting to Victoria's manipulations, letting her control the narrative, allowing her to cast me as the problem. Now, I had a chance to take control back, to fight for what was rightfully mine. But it meant going to war with my son's wife, potentially destroying his marriage, possibly losing him forever. Ruth must have seen the conflict on my face. "Margaret, that woman is a predator. She's destroying David just as much as she's hurting you. You're not breaking up his marriage. You're trying to save him from someone who sees him as nothing more than a stepping stone to your money." That evening, I called David's number. For once, he answered instead of letting it go to voicemail. "Mom? Is everything okay?" "David, I need to see you. Alone. Without Victoria. There are things you need to know about your wife." There was a long pause. "Mom, we've been through this. Victoria is just trying to help. You're making her out to be some kind of villain when she's actually trying to take care of you. David, please, just give me 1 hour. Meet me for coffee tomorrow morning. If you don't believe what I have to show you, I'll never bring it up again." Another pause, and I could hear Victoria's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "I don't know, Mom. Victoria thinks these meetings just upset you more. David, I'm your mother. I raised you. I've never lied to you. I'm asking for 1 hour of your time. Don't you think I deserve that much?" Finally, he agreed. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. The Starbucks on Morrison Street. But Mom, if you start attacking Victoria, I'm leaving." "I understand." After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hands, wondering if I was about to save my son or lose him forever. But Linda was right. Victoria was already destroying my relationship with David. At least now I had a chance to fight back. Tomorrow, David would learn the truth about the woman he had married. I just prayed he would be strong enough to handle it. I arrived at Starbucks 15 minutes early, clutching a manila envelope that contained copies of everything Linda and Patricia had discovered about Victoria. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee cup. David walked in exactly at 10 o'clock, looking around nervously as if he expected Victoria to materialize from behind a display case. He had lost weight since Robert's funeral, and there were dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than his 35 years. "Mom," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. "Before you start, I want you to know that Victoria is pregnant." The words hit me like a physical blow. Pregnant. Victoria was pregnant with my grandchild, and I was about to destroy her life, potentially taking that baby away from me forever. "David, that's wonderful news." I tried to make my voice sound happy, but all I could think about was how this changed everything. How could I expose Victoria's crimes when she was carrying my grandchild? "We haven't told anyone yet. It's still early. But Mom, this is why I need you to stop fighting us on everything. Victoria needs stability right now. All this conflict about the house and the will, it's stressing her out. The doctor said stress can be dangerous for the baby." Of course Victoria had told him that. Of course she was using her pregnancy as another weapon to manipulate him, to make me the villain who was threatening his unborn child's health. "David, there are things about Victoria that you don't know. Things I've discovered that you need to hear. His jaw tightened. Mom, please don't do this. Before Victoria married you, she was married to a man named Frank Thompson in Arizona. David blinked, clearly caught off guard. That's impossible. Victoria was never married before me. She told me I was her first husband. I slid the marriage certificate across the table. Frank Thompson, age 67. Victoria Martinez Thompson, age 32. Married June 15, 2018. Frank died 18 months later, leaving Victoria everything he owned. David stared at the document, his face going pale. Where did you get this? I hired a private investigator, David, because I knew something wasn't right about Victoria, but I needed proof. You hired someone to investigate my wife? I hired someone to investigate the woman who threw me out of my own home and is trying to steal everything your father worked for. David's hands were trembling now as he held the marriage certificate. There has to be an explanation. Maybe she was embarrassed about being widowed so young. Maybe she didn't want to talk about painful memories. I pulled out the photographs Linda had taken of Victoria with Harold Brennan. David, while she's married to you, while she's supposedly taking care of your pregnant wife responsibilities, Victoria has been targeting another elderly widower, a man named Harold Brennan. David looked at the photos, his confusion deepening. Who is this man? Why is Victoria having coffee with him? She met him at a grief support group, the same way she met Frank Thompson through a home care agency that specialized in elderly clients. Victoria has a pattern, David. She targets vulnerable older people, gains their trust, then manipulates them out of their assets. That's crazy. Victoria isn't like that. She's caring. She's supportive. She's a predator. The words came out harsher than I intended. David, Frank Thompson changed his will to make Victoria his sole beneficiary 3 weeks before he died of a sudden heart attack. The same heart attack happened after Victoria filled prescriptions for medications that can cause dangerous interactions. David stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. You're accusing my wife of murder. I'm telling you that the Phoenix police are reopening Frank Thompson's death investigation based on new evidence. This is insane. You've lost your mind, Mom. The stress of losing Dad, the change in your living situation, it's made you paranoid. He was using Victoria's words again. Her explanations for my behavior. Even faced with documented evidence, he couldn't see past her manipulation. David, sit down, please. Let me show you everything. No, I'm not listening to any more of this. You hired strangers to spy on my family. You're making up conspiracy theories about my wife, and now you're trying to turn me against the mother of my child. He started toward the door, then turned back. Mom, I think you need professional help. Real help. The kind of help Sunset Manor can provide. David, wait. Look at this. I pulled out the surveillance photos of Victoria meeting with real estate agents, getting appraisals on my house. She's been planning to sell my home before I was even out of it. She told an interior designer that she inherited the house from an elderly relative who moved to a care facility. David stopped walking, slowly. He came back to the table and looked at the photographs. She was just getting information for when you eventually decide to downsize. David, she told the interior designer she already owns the house. She's presenting herself as the homeowner. I could see doubt creeping into his eyes for the first time. The evidence was becoming too overwhelming to dismiss entirely. There's more. I showed him Linda's timeline of Victoria's activities since Robert's death. Every move she's made has been calculated to separate me from my assets and isolate me from you. The suggestions about my mental state, the pressure to move to assisted living, the changed locks on my own home. David sank back into his chair, staring at the documents spread across the table. But she loves me. She's having my baby. David, I don't doubt that some part of Victoria might love you, but I think she saw you as a means to an end. A way to access our family's wealth without having to wait for another elderly husband to die. Another elderly husband to die, he repeated quietly. You really think she killed Frank Thompson? I think Frank Thompson died very conveniently, just after changing his will to benefit Victoria. Just like she's been pressuring me to sign documents that would give her access to my assets. David looked up sharply. What documents? I pulled out the papers Victoria had presented to me the week before I was locked out of my house. Documents that would have given David and Victoria joint access to my bank accounts, in case of emergency, and power of attorney, to help with medical decisions. She wanted me to sign these the day before she had my locks changed. David studied the papers, and I could see him connecting the dots. If I had signed them, Victoria would have had legal access to my money and the authority to make decisions about my care. David, your wife is not the woman you think she is. She's a predator who has made a career out of targeting vulnerable people and taking their assets. My son sat in silence for a long time, looking through all the evidence I had gathered. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The baby. What about the baby? The baby is innocent in all of this. The baby deserves to have a father who sees clearly and makes good decisions. David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and his face went white. What is it? Victoria. She wants to know how the conversation is going, if you're being reasonable about the assisted living arrangements. He stared at his phone for another moment, then looked up at me with eyes that suddenly looked much older. She knew. She knew you were going to show me this stuff, didn't she? That's why she told me about the pregnancy this morning. She was giving me ammunition to use against you. I nodded sadly. Victoria is always one step ahead, David. She's had practice. David put his head in his hands. What am I supposed to do now? I'm married to this woman. She's pregnant with my child. Even if everything you're saying is true, how do I get out of this without destroying everything? You start by protecting yourself and your child. You make sure Victoria can't access any of your assets or make legal decisions on your behalf. And you help me stop her before she destroys another family. David looked up at me, and for the first time in months, I saw my son clearly. Not the manipulated puppet Victoria had been controlling, but the decent, intelligent man Robert and I had raised. What do you need me to do, Mom? 3 weeks later, I stood at my kitchen window, watching the morning sun stream through the curtains Robert had helped me hang 15 years ago. I was home, really home, in my own house, with my own key, surrounded by my own things. The events that led to this moment still felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. After David saw all the evidence about Victoria, everything moved quickly. Patricia filed the emergency restraining order, preventing Victoria from accessing or selling any of my property. Adult Protective Services launched an investigation into the elder abuse. Most importantly, David agreed to help us gather evidence of Victoria's ongoing schemes. The breakthrough came when David confronted Victoria about her previous marriage to Frank Thompson. Instead of offering an explanation, Victoria went into full attack mode. Your mother is a bitter old woman who can't stand that you chose me over her, she had screamed at David, according to what he told me later. She's making up lies to try to break us up because she's jealous of our happiness. But when David pressed her about the real estate appraisals and the meetings with Harold Brennan, Victoria's story began to fall apart. I was just trying to help that poor man, she had insisted about Harold. He's so lonely since his wife died. I was being a good friend. David asked her why she hadn't mentioned this friendship to him, why she was meeting Harold in secret. Victoria's response was to turn the tables, accusing David of spying on her, of not trusting his own wife. She got angry, David told me during one of our strategy sessions with Patricia. Angrier than I'd ever seen her. And when people get that angry about being questioned, it usually means they're hiding something. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Harold Brennan himself contacted Linda Carson after she approached him with information about Victoria's background. That woman has been trying to get me to change my will, Harold told Linda. She said I needed to make sure my assets were protected in case I got sick and couldn't make decisions for myself. She even brought me legal documents to sign. The documents Victoria had shown Harold were nearly identical to the ones she had tried to get me to sign, papers that would have given Victoria power of attorney and access to Harold's bank accounts. But Harold, unlike me, had a son who was a lawyer. When Harold mentioned Victoria's suggestions, his son immediately became suspicious and advised his father not to sign anything. She got very upset when I told her I needed to think about it, Harold said. She said I was making a mistake, that I'd regret not protecting myself. Then she started saying things about how hard it was to watch older people make bad decisions, how sometimes families had to step in to help. The same script Victoria had used on David about me. Armed with Harold's testimony and all the evidence Linda had gathered, Patricia went to the district attorney's office. Between the elder abuse charges, the suspected insurance fraud in Frank Thompson's death, and the attempted fraud against Harold, Victoria was facing serious criminal charges. The morning of Victoria's arrest was the hardest day for David. Despite everything he had learned about his wife, despite all the evidence of her manipulation, he still struggled with the reality of what was happening. "She's carrying my child," he kept saying. "Whatever she's done, she's still the mother of my baby." I understood his conflict. Even knowing what Victoria was, even after everything she had put me through, I felt sorry for the woman who was about to lose everything. But I felt sorrier for the people she had victimized. For Frank Thompson, who had died alone and confused. For Harold Brennan, who had almost lost his life savings to her schemes. For David, who had been manipulated into betraying his own mother. The arrest happened at my house. Victoria had come to confront me, furious that her plans were falling apart, probably intending to try one last manipulation to regain control of the situation. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard her key in the front door lock. Except it wasn't her key anymore. Patricia had insisted I change the locks again as soon as the restraining order was in place. Victoria rattled the door handle angrily, then began pounding on the door. "Margaret, open this door! I know you're in there!" I could hear the rage in her voice, all pretense of sweetness gone. "Margaret, you can't hide forever. This is David's house, too. I have a right to be here." Through the window, I could see Detective Morrison and Officer Chen approaching the front porch. Linda Carson had coordinated with the police, timing Victoria's arrival perfectly. "Margaret, open this door, or I'll call the police myself. You're trespassing in my house." That's when Detective Morrison stepped forward. "Victoria Martinez Phillips, you're under arrest for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft." The silence that followed was profound. Then Victoria began screaming. "This is insane! I haven't done anything wrong! Margaret, tell them! Tell them this is all a misunderstanding." I opened the front door slowly and stepped onto the porch. Victoria was handcuffed, her perfect makeup running down her cheeks, her carefully styled hair disheveled. "You did this," she hissed at me. "You poisoned David against me. You made up lies about my past. You're destroying my family." "No, Victoria," I said quietly. "You destroyed your own family when you decided to build it on lies and manipulation." That's when she saw David walking up the front path with Patricia and Linda. Her expression changed completely, shifting from rage to desperate pleading. "David, thank God you're here. Tell them this is all a mistake. Tell them your mother is confused, that she's making up stories." David looked at his wife with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but something like profound sadness mixed with disgust. "Victoria, I know about Frank Thompson. I know about Harold Brennan. I know about the real estate appraisals and the forged documents. I know everything." Victoria's face crumpled. "David, please, I'm pregnant. I'm carrying your baby. You can't let them do this to me." "You're carrying my baby," David said quietly, "but you were never really my wife. You were just using me to get to Mom's money." As Detective Morrison led Victoria to the police car, she looked back at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Margaret. I'll fight these charges. I'll prove you're the one who's been manipulating everyone." But her threats felt empty now. The truth was out. The evidence was overwhelming, and Victoria's hold over my family was finally broken. 6 months later, Victoria pleaded guilty to multiple charges of elder abuse and fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the requirement that she make restitution to all her victims. The baby, a little girl David named Sarah after his first wife, was born healthy and beautiful. David and I are rebuilding our relationship slowly. The trust Victoria broke between us will take time to heal completely, but we're making progress. He brings Sarah to visit me twice a week, and I'm teaching her to love the garden Robert planted, the same way I taught David when he was small. The Phoenix police did reopen Frank Thompson's case, but Victoria's plea agreement included immunity from murder charges in exchange for her cooperation in identifying other potential victims. Sometimes justice isn't perfect, but at least Frank's nephew in California knows the truth about what happened to his uncle. Harold Brennan sends me Christmas cards now. We've become unlikely friends, bonded by our shared experience of nearly being victimized by Victoria's schemes. He's doing well, surrounded by family who are more vigilant about protecting him from predators. As for me, I'm exactly where I belong. In the house Robert and I built together, surrounded by memories of our life, secure in the knowledge that no one can take that away from me again. Sometimes I think about Victoria, sitting in her prison cell, probably already planning her next scheme for when she gets out. I hope prison changes her, but I'm not naive enough to believe it will. What I do believe is that standing up for yourself, fighting for what's right, and refusing to be diminished by people who see you as weak or expendable is always worth the struggle. I'm 70 years old now, and I've learned that being older doesn't mean being powerless. Sometimes it just means being wise enough to recognize the wolves when they come dressed as helpers, and strong enough to fight back when they try to devour your life.